Welcome to the monthly Truck Stop webinar. Truck Stops are presented the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as a service to the members of the Motor Carriers Education Foundation. These webinars are presented as industry updates for information purposes only. They are not qualified for state CE credit. If you're seeking straight state CE credit, contact our office and we will send you information about the opportunities for the state CE. If you have any questions during this time frame, type them in the chat window and we'll try to answer them, but we'll answer them by email later after the presentation is over. Or if you have any problems listening to this, either visual or audio, call our office at 800-741-4084 and we'll attempt to correct the problems. We're looking at cell phone usage today. We're looking at from basic three areas. The first area we're going through real briefly is the federal regulations involving cell phone use. Then we got some samples of some cell phone procedures that your insured should be involved in. And then we're going to turn it over to a couple experts in this area. A lady who I met at a lawyers conference in Orlando a few months ago, where a friend that was the chairman of that time was Rob Mosley, which most of you know is the ACTA conference in Orlando. And she did a presentation about the forensics of cell phone when your insurers get subpoenaed for their records, what needs to be or what doesn't need to be produced. So I asked her to help us put this program together, and she'll introduce herself as well, along with someone who is an expert in analyzing this data, Lars, and then later. But here are the regulations, and this has been enforced a long time. The law prohibits commercial drivers from using a handheld mobile device while operating a commercial truck or bus. The drivers who violate the registration will face federal civil penalties from up to $2,750 for each violation and disqualified for operating a commercial motor vehicle for multi-offenses. The states will suspend a CDL after 2 or more serious violations. The commercial company, bus company, or truck company that allows the driver to use handheld cell phones while driving will face a maximum penalty of $11,000 a day. So it's dollars involved as well as the court cases. The use of mobile equipment is restricted for commercial drivers. Again, this rule restricts a commercial motor vehicle driver from reaching for or holding a mobile phone to contact a voice communication, as well as dialing by pushing more than one single button. Commercial motor vehicle drivers who use a mobile phone while driving can only operate a hands-free phone located in close proximity. In short, the rule prohibits unsafe reaching for a device, holding a mobile phone, or pressing multi-buttons. There's also no texting. Commercial motor vehicles are prohibited from texting while driving. So what qualifies as texting? Texts mean manual, entering alphabetically, texting to or reading text from or electronic device. This includes, but is not limited to, short messages, services, email, instant messages, a command or request to access a website, or pressing more than one single button to initiate or terminate a voice communication, using a mobile phone, or engaging in any other form of electronic text, retrieving or entering or presenting or future communication or feature from communication. This is the regs, and I get this question all the time from clients about what can be allowed and how cell phones can be used or not. And my point here for you who are listening to this in the insurance business, in the insurance areas, help your insured understand that the government's prohibiting this. This also why the plaintiffs' attorneys have another error in their to shoot at us if we misuse this reg and rules. So the motor carrier and drivers can be fined. The driver can lose their CDL, and plaintiffs' attorneys can use this information in attempting to establish liability when an accident occurs. So, cell phone policy. These are suggested wording that Lynn gave me that your insurers must incorporate either in their handbook for drivers or in the owner-operator contracts about cell phones. They can cite the federal regulation, but there's no cell phone usage, no usage at all, or there's limited use of cell phone for emergencies only, and then talk about how it has to be hands-held and with one finger activated. Then the policies must be communicated to the driver, and suggest to have the driver sign off on it and agree to it. And then you must enforce this. If you see the drivers using it, or if you have access to their cell phone records, if you're furnishing a cell phone to the driver, you must then have some policing of those things. And so these policies must be not only for the company drivers, the true employees, also for the owner operators. The difference is how you communicate. The owner operators independent contractor agreement would have to be modified to have these rules enforced, whereas a company driver can be instructed through however you're insured to communicate with their drivers, or handbook or memos. You want to keep the language simple. Use of cell phone and other mobile communication devices are prohibited while driving, or other actions with electronics such as watching smartphones, tablets, DVD players, or computer videos are also prohibited. Use of any type of electronic device to record video segments or the photographs while you're driving are also prohibited. Use of cell phones and other mobile devices while driving is a grounds for termination. That's the ultimate rule here. And later, when we get into this with Lynn's help, she'll tell us how important this is at crash time and how this distraction driving leads to a lot of crashes. You want to have the driver to confirm, I understand that texting while driving is a violation of the FMCSA regs. If I engage in texting while driving, I know I may be led, I know it may lead to the termination of my employment. If I engage in talking on the cell phone while driving, I understand that the first thing I will play or prohibited, and continue use may continue, I will lead to termination. Some policies same policy for owner operators as company drivers. Anyway, that's what we have here. The thing, I'm going to ask Lynn to put her 2 cents in, but I thought we'd start this. Well, Lynn, you want to?
Yeah. Let me, I'll introduce myself.
Okay, go ahead. And actually, Lars also.
My name is Lynn Castagna, and I'm an attorney with primary practice in Central Texas, although my practice takes me all through Texas, including a number of mostly liberal areas in Texas. My firm is Castagna Scott, and I've been practicing about 30 years, most of which my work, 90%, is with motor carriers. So I went back to some earlier slides on concerns, and let me move on. The motor carriers on the cell phone policies, let me just address this. I know Tommy mentioned some, but there's different varieties you can use in your policies. There's the no use or a limited use. I will tell you that the limited use of cell phones, only very, very few motor carriers use this policy because it's very difficult to monitor. I mean, if you have a policy and you don't have any teeth in the policy, plaintiffs' attorneys are going to hit you over the head with it. So how do you monitor a limited use of cell phones unless you're going to ask your drivers to randomly turn over cell phone records, sort of like random drug test, and that is a very difficult policy and procedures to keep in place. The no use also has its downfalls. In a real world, in litigation, in a perfect world, it'd be great if there was a no use policy, and in fact it was enforced. I think in the long run that helps the motor carriers. The problem is the no use is very hard to enforce, and you're going to have drivers always violating that, which will come back down to the carriers, the motor carriers, who then will state, well, you know, nothing was done to enforce this policy, and it becomes issues there. However, I have recommended some language to be used, either if you take a no-use policy or even if you go by the federal motor regs and allow the use of the policy, allow it if it's hands-free, one touch, and you got to keep that in mind. And I highly recommend that in any orientation process that the motor carriers have for drivers, that they emphasize the federal rule and the one-touch rule. This means that you can't just get your cell phone and go down the directory and figure out who you're going to call. You're going to have to speak into it, just saying, call mom, call dad, you know, something of that nature to stay within the rules. What happens with generally, you know, an officer that sees you driving down the street on the phone is going to pull you over, and that's when you're going to have the fine. That doesn't happen that often. Usually it comes into play when you're involved in an accident. And then the opposing counsel immediately wants to see cell phone records. And I mean immediately. I get spoliation letters within gosh, days of accidents, spoliation letters requesting cell phone records and the actual cell phones, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Lars will talk about in just a little bit. The policies must be communicated, as Tommy said, to the drivers. I like the idea, if you're going to have a no-use policy, then to have the driver sign off on it. If you're just going to follow the federal motor reg and say, okay, you can use it, but it has to be hands-free, still have the policy, and still have the policy where the driver can initial at the bottom. Again, I think this is good for the driver to know it's out there and for the driver to recognize what he's signing, but it also helps down the line if litigation ever occurs in the case. If you're going to have a no-use, problems with the enforcement of the policy is going to be similar to the limited use. If you're going to have a no-use, if your motor carrier is involved in an accident, then you have to be careful about, are you going to ask for their cell phone records after every accident regarding whether it's minor or major? How are you going to enforce that no use? How do you ask the drivers periodically if they're using it? Again, there's enforcement problems with all of this. So just real quickly, I highly recommend, whatever policy you're going to have, keep the language very simple. You don't want to put in there, we prohibit use of cell phones because it's absolutely dangerous, because a year down the line when one of your drivers involved in it, you're going to have that blown up for a jury to look at. You don't want to emphasize the danger of it. We all know the danger of it. It doesn't need to be in your policy. I would emphasize to the drivers or for the companies, and ask them to emphasize to the drivers that there's going to be grounds for termination if use is found, whether it be in a no-use policy and they use it, or it be in following the federal regs and they're using a phone that's not hands-free. So essentially, that's my position on the policies that a company should have regarding cell phone use, and it all really ultimately does come out when you have a lawsuit that occurs. It's an extremely big issue in Texas, and my understanding from speaking nationally on this issue that it is an issue in just about every state. I can tell you in the last 4 years, about 80% of my cases request cell phone use at some time during litigation, if not within the first 2 weeks of litigation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lars to talk a little bit about how we see it used in litigation, cell phone, and the importance of it. Lars?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So yeah, in a quick way of introduction, I'm Lars Daniel. I'm a practice leader of digital forensics with Guardian Digital Forensics. I'm an EnCE certified examiner and an Access Data certified examiner. Those are both computer forensics, an Access Data certified mobile examiner, which is cell phone forensics, and then a certified telecommunications network specialist, certified telecommunications analyst, certified wireless analyst, and certified internet protocol telecommunications specialist. All of those obviously relate to telecommunication. I've worked over 700 cases in my career. Many of them are trucking accident cases. I examined thousands of devices from cell phones to computers and everything else. Qualified and testified as an expert witness in state and federal court. I've qualified as a computer forensics expert, a cell phone forensics expert, digital forensics expert, photo forensics expert, and video forensics expert. I've written some books, which you'll see here at the end. With all that being said, though, let's hop right in and start actually this presentation with a case study. I find this to be a valuable way to do this because when we start with this case study, we can see how all these different pieces of evidence which are recovered both from cell phones and call detail records are used to paint a picture both by the plaintiff and the defense of the actual activity occurring at the time of an accident or surrounding an accident. So in this particular trucking accident, the evidence in this case that was used by the plaintiff and that we used obviously as well was the call detail records, the driver's log, and then the actual cell phone itself. And we're going to take a step back after this and look at some of the technology related to cell phone forensics. But right now, the plaintiff's claims in this particular case were twofold. First, that the driver was fatigued at the time of the accident, which resulted in part of the cause of it, but that the driver was also distracted or using the phone, doing distracted driving activity at the time of the accident, okay? Well, we examined both of those claims. The first related to the distracted driving. So let's talk about this first. The plaintiff's expert was claiming that because a piece of album art, an album cover, was downloaded on the cell phone of the driver at the time of the accident, that the driver must have had that cell phone in their hand and clicked to select a song. Well, upon forensic analysis of that cell phone and testing of iHeartRadio, as many of you who use that application know, every time a new song comes on, what does it do? It downloads the album cover, right? Completely unrelated to any activity that you do. It's automatically saved to your phone. We were able to show that, and that was not a point that they could argue at all. We were able to prove conclusively that this was not a distracted driving incident for that part. The second part that they were claiming was the driver was fatigued. Now, the slides that we're seeing are anonymized, but they are from the opposing expert's report in this particular instance. And what he did, and what lifestyle analysis is taking things like the driver's logs, right? I'm sure this group is familiar with these types of documents. So they take that information, you combine that with data from call detail reports, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. We'll have a much better understanding of the capabilities and contents of those documents. But you take that and you combine it with phone records. You combine it with activity recovered from the cell phone, the different forensic artifacts that show what we call user attribution, right? A user actually doing something with the device. And you create a timeline. And this expert was attempting to create a timeline to show when the driver was driving, when they were resting, incoming, outgoing activity. Combining all that, and what they ended up getting was this. They were doing a lifestyle or sleep analysis to see the largest gaps of time that the driver could have slept on each day. Now, if we look at this particular report, page from their report, we see that the gaps are very small, right? On Sunday, we have 2 hours and 23 minutes, an hour and 30 minutes, an hour and 16 minutes. So we have this odd phasal sleeping schedule that is claimed by the plaintiff's expert as being taken place. And this is saying that this is the largest amount of time he could have slept based upon his driver's logs, call detail reports, and cell phone usage. However, he made a critical mistake in this one. And that's one of the main points, is that with digital evidence, with cell phones and call detail records, the devil is in the details. It almost always comes down to a particular detail that causes significant issue and can drastically change your analysis of the actual data in a case. So in this particular example, this expert, what they did was they included all incoming activity to the phone from the records as activity that would shrink the window that the driver could sleep, right? So they counted it basically as meaningful in the point that you would be awake when it happened. Now, how many times have you gone to sleep and you wake up in the morning and see that you had, 10 new emails, 5 new messages, Facebook updates, you name it, right? All kinds of activity created on your phone, and you weren't there, you were asleep. When you pull that information back out, and so you can have an accurate examination and determine real activity you can prove, right? Outgoing messages, outgoing email, outgoing calls that connect coming in. So somebody hit answer the phone, he had a completely normal sleep schedule. All right, now that we've talked about that, yeah, please.
Lars, before we move on, I just want to interject here. I want everyone to know that what Lars just showed us is not an unusual tactic that occurs in litigation. It occurs in a number of my cases. And so it's really, really important, to preserve the cell phone and the cell phone records. You can also see why it might be good to have a policy of no use cell phone, because plaintiffs' attorneys love to cross-reference the cell phone data with that of the driver's logs. If you have a no use and it's enforced and your drivers don't use it, well, you take away this piece of evidence, or this for the opposing counsel. Go on, Lars.
Sure, that's an excellent point. So stepping back, I think it's valuable for our audience here, for you guys to understand a little bit about cell phone forensics. So we're going to take a quick dive into the actual technology and how the data is recovered. This will be quick, and then we'll get back to actually seeing the capabilities and the types of data that can be recovered, which is pretty fascinating and very relevant to this particular class as far as what it actually shows and what can be recovered. So the first thing to note is that with cell phones, we all kind of remember the day when we got a phone and we lost the charger years ago. You'd have to go to a special store to find the special adapter that hooked up to your special phone, right? There was not the standardization like we see today where it's basically the operating system and connectivity wars have been won. It's either Android or Apple, and you have only a handful of types of cables that you have to deal with. Well, as far as standardization that you see on the outside and your user experience with the operating system, we have much more standardization. But it's not standardization in the same as like you see with computer technology, right? Basically, any computer on the planet, I can go up to it and make it give me all of its data, included deleted data. Phones are more complicated than that, simply because they have not evolved as much as computer technology, simply because they have not been around as long. So when I say unique butterflies everywhere, what I'm referring to is that it seems like every day a new phone comes out, right? And every time a new phone comes out, cell phone forensic experts have to work with tool provider companies and then their own labs to reverse engineer those phones to get all the data off. When you're collecting the phone, and I think this does play a part when we're talking about first responders on a scene, there are issues that can take place which can compromise the evidence itself. And digital evidence is extremely fragile. What we're going to see here is what a forensic examiner would do. Keep in the back of your mind, if you were ever the first responder on a scene and take a phone, the best thing to do is simply to place it into airplane mode. That will preserve the evidence. However, for a forensics expert, we carry around these things called Faraday bags, right? These are special bags that you place the phone into that prevent it from receiving any wireless or cellular signal. So it completely blocks it. You've isolated that phone from any network so that it cannot receive any new data and cannot have anything else happen to it. It's preserved as a snapshot in time with what's contained on it. Faraday bag works the same as the technology in your microwave, right? It's basically the exact same thing. You're microwaving your lunch and you're looking through the glass, and that Faraday cage in that instance is keeping your head from being microwaved too, right? It's protecting you from all those microwaves in that box, so to speak. So why do we care about that? Why do we care about ensuring that the evidence is placed either in airplane mode or secured via Faraday bag? Two primary reasons. One, the ability to remote wipe devices. I have seen instances and cases where an opposing expert, at least in a couple of cases, forgot to isolate that phone from the cellular network, and it was remotely wiped while it was in their evidence locker, which is never a good thing. And the other reason, especially if you have a less sophisticated phone, you have a pay-as-you-go phone, a flip phone, which you can still purchase today, or other types of phones with limited storage capacity. As new data comes into the phone, it moves like a conveyor belt, and the oldest data is deleted to make room for the new. So you also will have issues of losing data that may be important to a case. Now, for our world, the phone should be collected and turned off, right? You typically do this if there's no concern to passcode lock or the passcode lock is known. The second option is primarily law enforcement only, that you're ever going to see this happen. Let's say an examiner gets on scene for any type of incident and they take the phone out of someone's hand and they place it into airplane mode. What they need to do, if they're concerned that there's a passcode lock, and like I said, this is law enforcement, you're only ever going to see this primarily, they can wiggle the screen back and forth to keep it awake so that they can then connect it to forensic tools to pull the data. Very situational that you'll ever see that happen. But what's not supposed to happen is thumbing through the phone to see all what's going on and this and that. When you're thumbing through the phone, you can permanently change data. And if we're concerned in particular about what someone has seen or not seen or opened or whatever else, if someone is thumbing through the phone on the scene, that can be highly problematic as it is changing data on the phone. So we're going to talk, go ahead, please.
When we're talking about collections of phones, and I think y'all need to know this might be an issue you want to talk about with your insured or the motor carriers on what policies do they have when there's a major loss or catastrophic loss on the driver's cell phone. I have a couple, and I would say they're the larger motor carriers in the industry that do have policies in place. They're not written policies, but they're verbal policies that say if you have a catastrophic loss or if you have a major loss, then we will take the driver's phone and we will send it to Lars, his company, similar company, to have it downloaded and to preserve the the actual data. Now, the problem that presents, as you know, none of us like to part with our phones. So that means that the motor carrier is going to have to replace that phone. Or, I mean, if you have a driver that doesn't mind it being taken for, Lars, would it take you how long to do this? 24 or 48 hours if it's shipped to you to download, ship it back?
Yeah, exactly. 24 to 48 hours is average.
You know, you may have a driver that would cooperate. Here's the other catch. And again, this is something for the motor carriers to discuss and policies to be determined beforehand. You know, if the driver refuses to give up his phone, which he has a right, that's his phone or her phone, you know, what do you do in that particular case? That becomes more of a human resource or human service issue that you have to deal with. So these are all issues that I encourage motor carriers to discuss beforehand because, again, cell phones is just a very, very hot topic right now in the industry and in accidents.
Lynn, let me ask two other questions. This is Tommy. You mentioned earlier about preservation of record of records and stuff, and how when you get that lawyer sends you the requirement to produce and preserve the records and those things. How do you do it if you don't have control of the cell phone in those areas? And is the driver part of that preservation order? And then how do you react to that? Because you know it's coming, and then you know this is a real concern here. And then what happens if the driver, you know, destroys it or doesn't come up with it?
Okay, so Tommy, there's two issues there. There's the actual cell phone itself, and then there's the cell phone records. And Lars and I will get in a little bit more details about the kinds of records. Okay. But the cell phone itself, you know, I get that the sharp and savvy attorneys in the large loss case will ask for the actual cell phone itself. And that is always the better evidence, okay? The cell phone records still presents a little bit of problems in that you need your driver to cooperate to get those records. In pre-litigation, before a lawsuit is filed, you cannot subpoena those records. So you need your driver. I used to think before Lars and I started doing a couple of these cases together, get an authorization from your driver and get those cell phone records ordered. I don't think that's the best means anymore. I think that's problematic on what you receive. The best would be for your driver to sit down with you or on his own, enter into his internet billing system, if he doesn't get it the old-fashioned way through the mail, and get his actual billing records that we get every month. Now, if it's a prepaid phone, you may have some other issues on it, but even prepaid phones, you can get some billing records on. That is the best way to do it. If you don't have the cell phone, or you don't think it's actually even a serious enough injury to say, hey, driver, turn over your cell phone, still get the billing records from your driver. Make sure that driver gives you those billing records, and soon after the accident. And then the little caveat there is just let your driver know that it doesn't mean you're turning over all those records, because they could have some privacy issues on it. It just means when it gets into litigation, what I will turn over, typically, unless a court orders me, is only 15 minutes prior to the accident and 15 minutes after. And if a court orders me to produce more, then I'll do so.
And you mentioned the accidents that they should do this. You mentioned the term catastrophic. Can you give some picture? I mean, I know that you got a lot of blood and a lot of dead people, but I've seen a lot of cases that hasn't had many blood and guts and all those things that end up being a bad case. You got any guidance in that area?
It's a determination based on if you have an attorney involved, you know, finding out if that's a terrible venue, if the small fender benders, which I have a lot of those in South Texas, that most people that aren't familiar with South Texas would say it's only worth, you know, 20, 30,000, when in fact at the end of the day, in 2 years of litigation, it's $500,000. My
father had an office in Far, Texas.
Right. And that's an area which is very dangerous. So, you know, if a client called me and said, hey, it's a small fender bender, and I would tell them there's no such thing of that in Far, Texas. And at that point in time, I would say get your cell phone records. Maybe not the cell phone itself, but you need the cell phone records. I'll tell you, in almost every accident that I'm involved in, because most of my territory are liberal venues, I get the cell phone records from my drivers. And I do that within the first 2 weeks, because sometimes my drivers are gone after 30 days or 60 days, or may be terminated based on the accident.
All right, let's talk types of acquisitions. This is the types of methods that data is recovered from cell phones using cell phone forensic tools. And the first we're going to talk about is logical, and we're going to go through these pretty quickly. But a logical acquisition, and that's the data recovery from the phone, where you're getting the data off of it in all of its various forms. A logical gets only still existing data. So this is data you can access and manipulate as a standard phone user. This includes your messages and emails and so forth like that. However, even though it does not get to deleted data, like we'll talk about here in a minute, it can recover deleted data. And as odd as that may sound, the reason is because many applications run on database type systems. They're database driven. So if you're familiar with the application Snapchat, for example, where I send you a message and after you open it in 10 seconds, the message is supposed to self-destruct and delete itself, it hasn't deleted anything. All the content still exists. For a normal phone user, when you're using Snapchat, it's marked that message in the database and says, don't show this to the user anymore. With forensic tools, we simply rebuild that database and are able to recover deleted information from applications like Snapchat and many others. The next form of acquisition we're going to talk about is file system acquisitions. So this recovers the logical data we mentioned and also deleted files. So I'm going to draw a picture in your mind here. If you can imagine a box in your mind, and the very top left of that box is a database, right? The database just tells us where everything lives on your phone, all your different files and everything else. The rest of that space is where the files are actually stored, okay? So when you delete a file on a phone and many electronic devices, what happens is that the file doesn't actually go anywhere. Just like with our application example for Snapchat, it just marks the database entry and says where that file lives or where that message or where that email lives. I can overwrite with new data when I need the space. So it has put that piece of information into an area that it knows it can use the space later. It hasn't deleted anything. So recovering that data is simply like pulling it out of the trash bin and flattening it back out for us, right? It's very simple to rebuild that database type information. And we'll see that here in a minute when we look at actual capability. The third type is a physical acquisition. Now this gets everything from the phone. We're getting that entire filing cabinet of the files you can access normally. We're getting those deleted recovered files, and we're also getting what's called unallocated space. Unallocated space is the same scenario where you have files that have been deleted, but this time the database entry that would point us back to where that deleted file lives, that's been overwritten and is truly gone. So we have to do things what is called like file carving, where we use file types or keyword terms to go in and collect that data. Now, if we move to capabilities and we start seeing the actual artifacts that are recoverable, we'll start seeing some of these deleted data types, and I'll be able to point out when it was deleted, recovered right now as we move forward. Before we get there, one more thing. You know, I used to make a joke that if you wanted a phone that was safe from cell phone forensics, you should go get the cheapest phone money could buy, the cheapest flip phone you could find. You put your top 10 people on speed dial, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. You go on YouTube, you get out your soldering iron, you find a YouTube video on how to burn out the data connection port on the bottom, those little shiny connectors you see. So you can still charge the phone, but you can't actually plug it up to pull data off of it with a computer or a forensic tool. And then you crack the screen, right? Then you have a pretty safe phone. We basically have a drug dealer phone, but it's a pretty safe phone at that point. That used to be the case until the development of chip-off and JTAG forensics. Basically what these are, and this phone is from a trucking accident, is the ability to take up a burned up and damaged phone, crack it open, pull the chip off, and get the data off of it as if the phone was fully functional. So that is also an option for us as well these days. But now let's look at some capabilities. Your phone is storing a tremendous amount of information about you. It needs to. In order to provide you with the best customer experience that you can possibly have, so your phone does all the things that you need it and want it to do throughout your daily life, they need information. Okay, so here's an example of that now, right? Wireless networks on your phone. If you've ever been walking around or driving around and you get pop-ups on your phone and ask, would you like to join this wireless network? You can say no, you can say yes. Many times it doesn't matter. What's actually happening is your phone is recording the instance that happened. It's recording the date and time, the application you were potentially using inside of it, and the name of the wireless network as you're driving around. These will also contain geolocation data inside of that information many times, which we will see in this slide. This is from actually a criminal case that we worked, but as you can see, this is where the gentleman was driving down the street, went to the crime scene and drove back. His phone is seeing every single wireless network as he's driving through and recording that in the data of the phone. So as you can see, the location data stored on phones can be very, very valuable. We also can recover location-based data from multiple sources. So this does not only mean wireless networks, it's also pulling it from GPS coordinates, which can be valuable in particular in trucking cases in some instances. Cell tower data, which we'll talk about in greater detail, and other types of harvested data, which can include Bluetooth connections. For a quick example, if you've ever turned off Bluetooth on your phone and it says, please turn that back on, it helps us to determine your location to a greater accuracy. That's because Bluetooth's range is very short, but the way it works is that you have your Bluetooth on, your Bluetooth's talking to another electronic device, which is talking to another electronic device, and it follows that entire rabbit trail to get the most accurate location activity about you. So when we're talking about actually holding the phone in your hand, user attribution, actually showing somebody using the phone, or if the lack of such evidence as we're going to see here, the lack of evidence of someone using their phone in a distracted driving case, we obviously have to deal with searches on the phone. These can be searches not only of the internet or on the internet using Google and so forth, but searches happen all over, right? Searches happen within the Play Store as we see here. Those are searches that were performed looking for applications. But as you see, we have date and time stamps down to the second. If you look in the top right, we have YouTube. You could be looking for a video or anything on YouTube, and we know that YouTube is basically the human repository of all knowledge in video form. You can learn anything on YouTube. And then we have in Chrome in the bottom, your standard web browser on an Android phone in this example. So all of these searches, and the point is with this is that just about anything you search for on the phone, there's going to be a record of it stored on the phone with a date and time stamp and everything else. So that type of information obviously is valuable in determining what was happening with the phone at a point of impact. As a quick example of this, we did a trucking case where a young lady had a collision with an 18-wheeler and died. And this one, we did examine her phone as a part of the analysis. And examining her phone, we were able to see that exactly the reported time of impact from witness statements and the law enforcement reports, the exact moment of impact, she is hitting search within a web browser, searching up the obituary for a friend who had passed. So that point of impact, showing that she was hitting search, showing that the plaintiff was actually the one who was distracted at the time of the accident, not the driver. Here's an example of internet history. Once again, just showing the Google searches recovered. Obviously, internet history is going to be thousands and thousands of records. If you're using the internet and it's jumping from one page to another, or you click a link, or you do this or that, or anything else, it's creating a record and saving it in the internet history. Typical internet history pulled from a phone is thousands, if not tens of thousands of individual website records. And many of those records are inside the same website, right? So if you're doing a browsing session and you're only on one website and you're looking around, it's not uncommon for it to create hundreds of records down to the second going through all of that information. One more example of that when we're talking about these types of issues, and as independent experts, we examine these phones and explain the forensic details. We had a case at one point where a driver was using a phone, analyzing those records from the internet history. We were able to determine that he was playing a game online, and while he's playing that game, it's basically a game saying, determine what nationality you should be based upon what pizza you like. And at the point where he hits the click to see his results is the point of impact where there was a collision with multiple vehicles. That's the type of information that internet history is going to allow us to see as well, to a very granular level. Obviously, call logs, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we can recover call logs. And just as a note, anywhere you see these red X's, that means that is a deleted piece of information that has been recovered. Now, because it's deleted doesn't necessarily it's deleted by a person. It could be automatically deleted by the phone for some reason. That has to be determined in greater detail, but just note that where you see the X is a deleted message that has been recovered. What I really want you to see here, because we can see the time of the call's duration and so forth, which is very valuable. But look at the very bottom right. You'll see an outgoing call for 000000 seconds. The reason that this is important is primarily because of this, okay? If I click to call you and click cancel, that puts the phone in my hand, clicking to call you and clicking cancel, right? That has to be an activity performed by a person. And all these slides, this data we're seeing is coming from the actual cell phone itself. Let's make sure we understand that and not confuse us with records, which we'll talk about shortly. But that puts a phone in someone's hand doing activity at that time. That call being 0 seconds is not long enough to connect to a cellular network, which means it would not create a record in a call detail report or a phone bill. And messaging, right? Kind of the big one in the room, as we see. This is one of the primary issues that we run into with all types of phones. But everywhere you see these X's, once again, are deleted messages. And when we look to the right, what I really want you to see under analyzed data are two things. When you see chats and you see the iMessage communications, those are Apple-to-Apple communications. So Apple device to Apple device or iPhone to iPhone. I send you a message and it shows up as blue. If it's blue, it's iMessage. If you get one that's green, that's SMS or short message service message. We'll talk about that in a minute, actually right now, because as you look down, we see SMS messages, right? At the very bottom of that, 13,238 standard messages. Well, these messages, although they're for your interfacing when you're actually answering or responding, don't seem very different. They are, okay, in the way that they work in the cellular system. SMS messages are transmitted in a particular way through the cellular system where they create a record in a call detail report or a phone bill, okay? So you would have evidence of 13,238 messages existing. For the iMessage communications, which there are 28,146 of, those are transmitted via data. The reason that matters is any application, iMessage, Snapchat, Kick Messenger, WhatsApp, Skype, anything that transmits messages via data does not create a record in a call detail report or inside of a phone bill. That information will be transmitted via data, and the records, when you see them for the call detail reports, when it talks about data, has a disclaimer that data cannot be used to determine anything basically about that information. So when we talk about media as well, one of the important things to note is that media can provide information about multiple things. So you have pictures that are taken, right? And in many instances, whether it's a case or an insurance claim or anything else, knowing when a picture was taken matters. That can be important. In particular, one of the things to note is that just because there's a capture time right here, the capture time is when the photo is actually taken, right? That's inside what's called metadata, which is data about data. This is data embedded inside of a digital file that tells us a whole bunch of stuff about it. If I sent you a file right now and you looked at the created date, that does not indicate when the picture was taken. That's related to a totally different set of data for the file system on your local computer. So not to make this overly complicated, but in order to determine the exact time a photo was taken with a cell phone or a digital camera or anything else, you must examine the metadata to pull the capture time or date taken time. The other interesting thing here is you see with these photos in the metadata field, we have a latitude and longitude coordinates, right? So it's taking that photo, it's geolocating you. Many electronic devices do this, in particular phones, so that they can then take all your photos and organize them for you inside of your cloud-based app that backs up all your data, or if you're on Instagram, so people can see that you were in Florida on your vacation, and they can populate little maps and so forth. But that data is inside those photos. Powering events as well. If you needed to determine if the phone was on or off at that time, we can determine by examining powering events when the phone was turned on, when the phone was turned off, and sometimes the duration of those events, of them being on and off. Even things like your notes, right? If you're creating a note on the phone, that creates data about when the note was created. We can recover the deleted notes. We see the modification time, which shows the last time you opened that note, started typing inside of it. Once again, putting a phone in someone's hand doing an activity. And as we get to the trucks, once again, one of the main things, and the question we get asked often, is can we show that they were hands-free? Now, I'd love to hear some comments from our other guys on the phone about this, but with the federal rules that you can only touch one button to begin and terminate a call, I find that confounding to some point, simply because to unlock your phone, if it is locked, it's going to require more than one touch no matter what you do. But let's say it is Bluetooth and connected, and you've connected a wireless headset that you can talk to your phone to issue commands with no touching. We can determine when you connected that Bluetooth device and all the devices that are associated with your phone, whether that's a wireless headset or so forth.
Well, most of the time, the phone's going to be activated all the time anyway, like yours are not. Lynn, I don't think that would be a problem, is it?
Oh, I mean, it's not a problem essentially, but again, I do think you make a good point, Lars, that there's a lot of different phones out there and types of phones, and reading the black letter law, the federal motor regs, it does have to be a one touch. And so it becomes problematic. The Bluetooth one, what most of my drivers have are Bluetooth, which seems to be very close to one touch. You know, they can have it programmed where they just speak into who they want to call or dial out to, or press one button when a phone call's coming in.
Lars,
yeah, that's excellent.
Lars, let me ask you a question. Now, we haven't gotten to the cell phone records here. What we just went through, is that available only when you have the phone, or can some of this stuff be available through the cell phone records themselves?
Some of this data is going to correlate in a holistic way to the cell phone records. Much of what we've seen, the vast majority, is only going to be accessible from the actual phone itself through a forensic analysis of the phone. A call detail record is going to tell you what has happened that connected to the cellular network, which is going to be phone calls, some text messages, and that's primarily it as far as usable data.
Lynn, in this case, how often is a cell phone even available after this? I mean, again, it's owned by the driver. They aren't part of the service of the preservations of the evidence. The cell phones always get entered into court, or is there ways that you keep it from entering in, or they're just not available?
Well, let me add to that. The letters that we receive on spoliation, they are duplicates. One sent typically to the motor carrier and the other one sent to the driver. So the driver is bound by those letters to preserve his or her cell phone. As I tell my clients, I'd rather be dealing with an argument to the court on trying to prevent evidence coming in than face what we call a spoliation charge. And for those that may not be familiar with that, it's, at least in Texas, that if you discard some type of evidence after knowing that there is a major accident or that evidence is relevant, then you can be charged, or the jury would be charged with a instruction indicating that you can presume that evidence was adverse to the case or to the defense.
Yeah, when she says charge, excuse me, when she says charge, that's what the judge tells the jury on this part, not charge, not a fine. But, right, okay.
That's right. So it is to the driver as well, and it is something the driver must do. I mean, I think you have to explain to the driver, either your safety department or your attorney, the ramifications of what that means, because there are sometimes drivers don't want to give them up, and frankly, a lot of times they don't want to give them up is because there is information on there that could be adverse. I mean, I will have drivers on a number of occasions tell me they weren't on their phone, and a year down into litigation, we find out they're on their phone.
Yeah, always. Okay, thank you.
Sure, and to circle back around with all that, what really matters is putting this all in the timeline, right? Because we're typically talking, as Lynn stated, 15 minutes before, 15 minutes after the accident, so that you can determine the activity. Otherwise, it can become problematic with the amount of data that's on there, in particular, because you never know what people are into or what they may be searching for that could be used in an inappropriate manner at trial or in court or anything else. So you can filter all this data down to only show very specific sections of time. And there's nothing better than digital evidence for creating extensive timelines. And here's such an example of that, where we see just a matter of a short period of time here, the SMS activity, we have instant messages, web history, everything correlated in a timeline that allows it to be easily digestible. All the data from the phone inside of an advanced analysis piece of timeline software showing both the activity that occurred, the date and time that occurred, the people involved, and the content that is requested to be included as well as a part of that timeline. Contents being the photo or the video watched or the website accessed or the actual text sent back and forth in the messages. Just so you know, this is a tiny bit unrelated, but this is something you can actually see on your own phone in your own account. And this is just kind of a fun thing as a quick aside that has been used in evidence in some cases that we've done. But Google is watching, okay? So what you're seeing here is a test that we did from our old office. We've moved since then, where one of our people went from their home, that address is blotted out, to our office, to North Hills, and then back home, right? Well, the interesting part about this is that this is being recorded without any mapping software being open, with nothing being open. All that is being recorded inside of the Google account associated with the phone. So that you can see all of the activity and where they went, whether they're driving or walking or otherwise moving inside that time period on that date. So Google is recording that as a part of their activity. And the other thing Google is doing, and all of them are doing this, not just Google, I'm just picking on Google at the moment, is Google is listening, right? So you can say, hey, Google, and ask it to tell you something, and it will record right in your account what you said. You said address. You said FastMed urgent care, right? What time is it in California when you're asking a question? So not only is it recording in text what you said, for each one of these, if you click on the link when you're using this, it records your voice saying it, and it actually saves that little audio file of you asking the phone a question. So just a fun little tidbit there to make you a little more paranoid even. If the phone, let's say it's gone, destroyed, whatever else, many times we can pull the relevant data or necessary data from the cloud, to the iCloud or whatever else backup service related to a particular model of phone. And also, if this is an instance that happened at some point in time, a backup on a computer of a cell phone is as good as having the phone itself. Now, that is not as relevant in trucking accident cases simply because the activity that's concerned is contemporaneous to an incident. All right. Now we're going to talk about records. First of all, we're going to talk about how the cellular system works, and we're going to do this in a tiny nutshell because we have a very limited area that we truly care about when it comes to these types of incidents, beyond knowing, let's say, for example, location-based activity like you may be concerned with in a potential arson or something like that. So these are cell towers, right? We've all seen cell towers. They seem to be ubiquitous these days. They're everywhere, but they are hidden on the sides of buildings. They're attached to just about everything you can imagine, including church steeples and bells. They're hidden all over the place, not so cleverly disguised as trees and cactuses and everything else as you're running around. But what is a cell site? That's really what these are when you see those. They're truly a cell site, and you have basically a pole with antennas on them that are sending and receiving signals from cell phones. But the critical thing to note is that everything goes back to the ground, right? They go back to a base transceiver station and go out to the cellular network. I'm not going to bore you with too much of this technology, but there's a few things we really need to understand. First of all is co-location. This is very important when we begin to talk about the actual records themselves, okay? When we're talking co-location, what that means is that there's these towers, and there's all these antennas on them. The providers share the same towers, okay? So Sprint, Verizon, T-Mobile, you name it, could all be on that same tower. They're all sharing the same pole so they can provide service coverage to that area. This is important because sometimes you'll see an expert who goes online to towersearch.org or something like that to pull a list of towers in the area to try to determine this or that, and they're not understanding that a phone can only talk to a tower it's authorized to talk to. Just because we have Sprint, Verizon, and T-Mobile on here doesn't mean AT&T could use this tower, because they can't, right? They may not be able to use that particular tower. We'll see why that's very important in a minute. In particular, as we talk about and look at switches from a real map. So what is a switch, okay? All cell towers cover a certain area. Those are basically, when you get back to it, are covered by a switch. The switch controls a section of towers. So we'll understand this in greater detail coming up in just a second with the switches, okay? But here's how it works, right? The cell phones talk to the towers. We can see our little cell phone talking to the tower there. That goes to a base transceiver station back to what's called a radio network controller. It takes a little detour to the home location registry to make sure you paid your bill, and goes back to the public network, to the ground, to wires in the ground, okay? Now, I know this is a lot to absorb, but here's how it works, right? The cell phone connects. It's always local. One of the important things to note, and the reason that matters, is if you get a phone bill, exactly as Lynn was stating, when you get the billing records for a particular person through like the internet, or you get a phone bill in the mail, that's always going to be in local time to the phone, right? That way you don't have to do all kinds of crazy conversions and stuff to determine when something happened. That's very important. But that's not the same when you're dealing with a call detail report. Call detail reports could be in different time zones, based upon the switch, based upon particular issues related to the carrier and so forth. And here is such an example. So here we have a set of towers that are controlled by a single switch, okay? Now a switch can be in New Orleans or somewhere else even further out, and be based on the city called something related to the city of New Orleans, but actually the towers spread out through multiple states. They're controlled by that switch that's been named and put in a particular location by a particular cell phone provider. So why do we care about that? Here's why we care. If the records you get are provided, let's say in Eastern time, but your accident happened in Central time, and you try to analyze it based upon the records, you're going to be an hour off for everything because it hasn't been adjusted to the time of the switch. This happens regularly from what we see. We saw a case the other day where actually what would happen is they're claiming that the driver was on the phone doing all this activity at the time of an accident, and they hadn't calculated this particular vendor's records, where everything was calculated in UTC 0, okay? What that means is that in order to get it into Eastern time, for example, it's -5 or -4 hours difference, depending on daylight savings time. So in essence, what happened is that he's calculating activity that's not even on the same day at that particular instance, okay? The driver was doing nothing in that case at the time of the accident. All right, call detail records, right? And I know Lynn has mentioned sometimes you don't want to get these, and I think many times the reason is when you get these from a plaintiff or plaintiff looks at these, they will make unnecessary complications because they don't necessarily understand the information, or they can make a lot of hay out of what the records appear to say when they don't necessarily say that. So what are they? Now, first of all, they're a legal proof of the service provided. They're a technical roadmap of a call, and they are a financial transaction record, right? These records are primarily kept so that they can prove the provider themselves, like a Verizon or Sprint, that you paid your bill and they provided you a service. The other reason they keep these records is so that they can bill each other. You're roaming on someone else's network, that provider is going to charge whoever your provider is so they can get paid for that, right? You may have an unlimited plan, but they're still charging each other for all of that activity. These are not designed to determine what every single person did down to the second, not what they're designed for. So how do you get them typically? And I know Lynn could talk to this in much greater detail, but oftentimes the account holder can request with a notarized letter their own records via subpoena, via discovery. That's how we often see them attained. And we do provide that subpoena language if you ever would have a need for it. So call detail records are available depending upon the carrier for different ranges of time. This is just something that is valuable to know, that many of them keep it on rolling 12 months, so you'll be able to get these records through Verizon. AT&T keep them for a whole 7 years. Sprint 18 months. So as far as getting the records with the litigation and time frames, typically in a trucking accident, it's not going to be terribly difficult to get those. It's usually in old murder cases or something where the records might be gone at some point because nobody got them at the point of interest when the investigation started. So what can they contain? Voice call activity, call forwarding information, which is important to note, text message transactions, and data transactions, right? That's what's contained inside of a call detail record. And they're used to associate a phone with a particular cell tower or location, not as important to us in these cases, to show connections between phone numbers, frequency of connections, and user activity is primarily what we're going to talk about in this particular instance. Phone bills also show user activity. Once again, they are in local time. And some of the differences, once again, is a quick way to see it all at the same time, is the phone bill is always in local time. Remember, the call detail record is relative to the switch. You have to do a lot of time calculations to make sure it's in the right time. Time sometimes, even with Sprint, is always in a single time zone and doesn't follow anything else like that we've actually mentioned already, and shows some non-user-based activity. So that's one of the things that a lot of times get confused for actual user activity. I'll show an example of that here in just a moment as well. Real quick, what about prepaid or burner phones? This is important to note. Just because you have something like your Boost Mobile or whatever else, all of these pay-as-you-go phones are really just appendages to a Verizon or another organization's larger network. They're basically just like franchises of that. So you've just got to go to the correct place to get the records. So T-Mobile has their own, Verizon has their own, basically burner phone companies. All right, you can find the carrier information for a phone number. If you get that phone number at phonefinder.net. Those records usually only exist 90 to 180 days. All right, call detail records and time zones. Let's look at some fun examples here. And this one is actually out of Texas, which makes it fun. So CDMA text messages, that's a particular type of transfer of information of messages and calls. It's a code division multiple access. It's the way the towers are designed and they split up frequencies and so forth. Are stored in server located in Texas, Central Standard Time, right? But they're GSM messages, which is a global for system for mobile communication, a different type of technology to transfer messages and data across the cellular network, are stored in Pacific time, as you see. So all of this information creates a really fun world when you get down to it as far as the time zone conversions and making sure that you're analyzing the data correctly. So if we're looking at the call detail record for AT&T, you see all of this data, right? We see connection times, seizure times, originating, terminating numbers, all this types of data. And this is just one example of one carrier. Let's look at another carrier. This is Sprint, and you have all this information like that. The main thing to see here is just how complicated it is versus a phone bill, right? A phone bill is much less difficult to understand and to read. And the reason this becomes very important, let me talk about this quick, and we'll see that. I apologize. So data usage is not an indicator of user activity, right? Outgoing text can be an indicator of user activity with exceptions. We'll cover that in a minute. But if you have someone who says, and we get this in our cases, we're looking at the data that's been transmitted inside of a call detail report, and it's like 10 megabytes that's transmitted. So that has to be, it means somebody's watching a video or somebody's accessing Facebook or something like that. There's no way to show that at all. That is pure speculation. Your phone, as we're speaking right now, is probably downloading an update for an app, or it's doing any other number of activities. It's fetching emails, and there's a big attachment, but you're not doing anything. So data transmissions cannot be used for user activity to show anything with any kind of, with any proof whatsoever in reality. If you need to know what's happening via data, you have to get it from the cell phone itself. So this is from the cell phone itself. These are data log entries, recording that inside the phone. And we can see, for example, Snapchat, the very first one being used at a date and time, which is a database application. FaceTime is as well, which you see further down. We have tips, maps, going to my account, the Spinrilla, all types of stuff like that. These applications, that is showing data activity. You have to have the phone.
Let me provide a little bit of introduction on this one. This is really what it comes down to is an example how in reality this all works that Lars has been talking about. This is a case that I had with Guardian. I had to call in Guardian Digital help us with. And this is why I say and advise my clients, you want the billing records. If you can avoid getting these detailed cell records that we're talking about, avoid it. And in about, I'd say 80% of my cases, when I turn over the billing records of my driver to an opposing counsel, they are satisfied. In this particular case, I had a very prominent and reptilian type of plaintiff's attorney, a heavy hitter plaintiff's attorney on the other side. So he took me to court. He he wanted the actual cell records, the cell detailed records, and the court ordered 24 hours of my driver's record. I had spoke to my driver, I mean, the day the accident happened. The next day he gave me his billing records, and he said, I wasn't on the phone at the time. This is a 5-car accident, truck accident, actually, in vehicles in San Antonio. My driver said the last time I spoke was to my wife at 10:30 that morning. I did not speak on that phone until after. This was also a motor carrier that had a no-use cell phone policy. This driver had been with the company 29 years. So great credibility. I believed him. I get these cell phone detail records in, and I look at it and I go, okay, well, we have a problem here, because it looks like, and this was plaintiff's counsel's argument, that my driver between 10:40 and 3:40 when this accident happened was on 10 calls. 2 of them were easy to explain. I believe they were call forwarding, so my driver never had to pick it up. The other ones weren't so easy to explain. And so I called Guardian Digital Forensic and asked for help on the interpretation. They had an expert as well involved. But this is what you get down to. When you get the more detailed, more complex, detailed records, that's when you need the experts to come in, because plaintiff's counsel will manipulate them. And I'll let you talk about what's on this and how you explain this, Lars.
Yeah, absolutely. The main point here is every time you see a 5 that we see here that plaintiff thought was actual user activity, that's a routed call. So what does that mean? What that means is that this is a call or an activity inside these records, for lack of a better term, that is done automatically by the actual provider themselves. This is not user activity. This is the provider doing something to make sure that you can maintain your service. So all of those, as you see in the red box right there that we have circled, and they explain this in the call direction, any other letter or number is a routing or unknown call type. It does not detail actual transactional data. Actual transactional data is data that means something, right? Like a phone call or text message done by a person. So none of that is actual legitimate activity that can be used for anything. That is simply automated activity that has nothing to do with an actual user.
The problem is trying to explain that to a jury. My position is I always rather avoid that, so keep it simple, because this case did end up resolving the week before trial, but this was the key argument back and forth between the plaintiff's counsel and myself till the day we settled the case.
All right, one more example. We're just about reaching the end here. This is an interesting case too. This is a case where there was allegedly a hit and run, allegedly a truck hit the plaintiff's vehicle and then drove off, right? And they're swearing up and down that it's their car. This is one of those instances where the location, where you determine what cell tower they're connected to at the time, mattered. Because in this one, the truck, when they allegedly hit the person, was 24 air miles away. They were way too far away for this to be possible in any way, shape, or form. As you can see that incredible distance there. Basically, this was making up something to try to get some insurance money.
You mean they would really do that?
I think you can see that cell phones are good and bad. I mean, the information from perspective of when you get into litigation, you can use it against a plaintiff, that may be driving using the cell, as well as they use it against our driver. But the bottom line is it's a big issue these days, and it's something that really should be thought out by the insurers, the motor carriers, and policies in place on how it's handled at the end of the day.
Would you recommend that, again, going back to make sure everybody has something in place? Because I didn't ask this question earlier, but can the plaintiff's attorney also subpoena their cell phone rules and regs, and how does that come up in court, Lynn?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's why I said early on, you know, when you have those policies, make the language in writing very simple, because if you put a detailed description in why you don't want them to have use of cell phone, or no use policy, because it's dangerous and statistically this is what it shows, how many accidents it caused, that's going to be blown up in closing arguments by the plaintiff's counsel. So it helps it helps the motor carrier to have a policy. And if the driver violates it and you have some mechanism in place to monitor that driver and the cell phone use, then it's certainly at the end of the day that policy helps the carrier. There's no question about it.
Well, based to put there, since it's a federal regulation, can't they just refer to the federal regulation and let it be that no cell phone use per this regulation? Were that
yes,
part
they
of it?
do that.
Well, right.
Absolutely. Well, the cell phone, the regulation says cell phone use, but it's got to be hands-free. If you're going to have an absolute no use, then you're going one step further and actually, you know, a higher standard or a more firm policy against it. And, and again, I think it's a good policy. You just have to be careful on how you term it in the policy, what language you use.
Now, as you mentioned, alligator, and that's not, we're from Florida, so the reptile lawyers, and some of you might not realize those are the ones that we talk about who are trying to use, other than what happened that day, to imply more liability to our insurers. And this is where the CSA records and SM records come in place, and these kind of things come in place. This is what we talk about here. They all tend to subpoena these records, correct? I mean, this happens all the time.
They will tend to subpoena it. Or, as I said, if you will hand over early in the litigation, when a lawsuit's filed, hand over the billing records, they won't take the next step to subpoena it. You get those detailed records when you subpoena it. So I try to stop them by producing the billing records, which are more simplistic. And frankly, if your driver's not on the phone and the billing records show them, hand it over in pre-litigation. You know, avoid that. Get that, you know, get that out of the way.
Now, one other question in this part. You mentioned how much of these records we have to show. Do you then redact all the time frames on these records that are not germane to the accident itself, the day before or the hour before, or whatever the court allows you to not have to produce?
When I produce them, and it's the billing records, I will redact anything that's, I will only produce 15 minutes before the accident and 15 minutes after. Everything else will be redacted. However, if a court orders me after I have a fight in court over it to produce 24 hours, then I can't redact anything from those 24 hours.
So that's what the judge ends up saying. All right. And you recommend, obviously, when they're production, to have the lawyer involved to screen everything before they put it over, to make sure there's no oh my goshes in this without us knowing about it.
Yes. Obviously, how many or in your litigation, you're claim representative, you're claim insurance carrier actually have the billing records are pretty simplistic. It's billing records aren't interpreted. It's the detailed records you get when it's issued.
Lynn, I'm sorry, we lost you in that last part. Went garbled again. Well, anyway. I think this is to the end. Lars, we appreciate your time. Lynn, we appreciate you putting this together. This is, did you have one other thing, Bob?
Yeah, one last thing real quick, and then we'll be finished up with the forensic stuff here. And this is basically it, right? Some phones and services automatically respond to incoming messages. So you're driving, and you receive a message, and my phone will automatically respond to you and say, hey, I'm driving right now, so don't call me. Or some phones will hold a message and send it later based on connectivity. The main thing I wanted to explain here is that if somebody gets a call detail report and it looks like there's all these messages sent back and forth, it could be that automatic message. It could be an automated message saying, hey, I'm driving. It's not a user actually touching the phone. It's a driver being very responsible. The second thing is that it could look like a message was sent at exactly a particular date and time from the call detail records. But when you actually look at it and look at the phone, which is the only place you can determine when somebody actually hit the send button, what had happened is that phone got pulled up into the queue for sending messages out, and it didn't send immediately, right? We've all had situations where you send a message and the person doesn't get it for much longer after, and that can be caused by multiple things, whether you're talking about buildings blocking the way, or trouble spots, or man-made obstructions like a big being a side of a building, natural obstructions, right? Because organic things absorb radio waves. So, for example, if you've ever been on the phone and turned your head, your phone's absorbing all the radio waves, and then you turn your head, and all of a sudden you can get a better signal. It's because your head was blocking the way of the cell tower. But all that can cause a message not to be sent immediately. It can be held up to 72 hours, and typically potentially trying to send it later. So if your driver says, I was definitely not sending or receiving messages, it may be time to examine the cell phone to see what actually occurred when the message was truly sent, or if they have an autoresponder turned on. And that is all that I have.
You just scared me enough. I'm going to get ready and get back to a dialer phone and forget all this kind of stuff. This is scary stuff. But the important part about it is our insureds need to be prepared for this, because it's going to happen. Anytime you have a crash, this kind of record's there. And so, Lynn, we appreciate you. Lars, we appreciate you telling us how you analyze this stuff. Lynn, obviously you rely heavily on people like this, because about 80% of the stuff he talked about is technology I don't understand in this area, but obviously the judge and the jury needs to understand this. So we got to get somebody who can actually give you enough information to defend this in court. And then you get involved in this early on. And what we're saying is the insured needs to understand these are going to be subpoenaed. So therefore, or have to be produced. So therefore they need to take precautions with your driver to make sure these records are available. Is that the bottom line to where we went today?
That's exactly. I think you just have to be proactive on it.
Right. Lynn, we appreciate it. Lars, we appreciate it. We hope everybody has a happy holiday. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll see you next month on the Truck Stop webinars, which is the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. We're out of here.